Welcome to the opening episode of our first 100 Days in Office podcast series. We'll delve into the elected party's policies and how this could impact sectors, businesses, and individuals. With under a week to go until the country goes to the polls, today we're going to compare each party's manifesto, looking in particular at the views of the economy, income taxes, capital gains tax, pensions, closing some of the tax loopholes for non-domiciled individuals, and corporate taxation. I'm Paul Barham, Head of International Private Client, and today I'm joined by our Chief Investment Officer, Ben Seeger-Scott, a Senior Financial Planner from the team, James Robinson, and Lucy Marshall, Corporate Tax Director. Ben, if we begin with you, a lot of the headlines coming from the party manifestos were focused on the economy. What pledges stood out for you? Do you think they're achievable?
Thanks, Paul. I mean, I think the main thing that jumped out at me is the lack of any real deep economic proposals. Indeed, I think the Institute of Fiscal Studies called out a conspiracy of silence over how the books are going to be balanced. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but I think all of the parties are facing the reality that the tax burden is very high, spending commitments are high, public services are still under strain, and borrowing costs are high, which means none of them really have any room to maneuver or differentiate. And that's really come through, I think, in the manifestos. I think what all the parties are highlighting is this need to achieve growth. That means productivity. Growth is how you get out of these binds. You grow your way out of trouble. But frankly, looking at the manifestos, at the moment, there's a lot of hope, not very much strategy. And I think there is an inference there that strategy will come after the election is out of the way. But it's not clear from the manifestos that we're seeing at the moment. I think there are some positive points in there, but really there's a lot of commonality across the major manifestos, and in particular tend to focus on the Conservative and Labour manifestos. I think the tax exemptions we've seen of the last couple of years in areas around research and development, those will help business productivity. None of the parties are looking to roll those back, so that could support medium-term productivity gains. Equally, there's a common point of no intention to increase corporation tax. What happens down the line and whether they come down, there's a bit of differentiation between the parties. But I think the main point is no real intentions to increase that corporation tax. That could be, if not a positive, then certainly not a negative for the economic and business outlook. I think in terms of some of the more eye-catching plans, Labour, of course, have a plan to create a Great British Energy Corporation that's going to be partly funded by a windfall tax on oil and gas. Labour's also announced a plan to set up a national wealth fund that's going to be focused on clean technology. Now, these are emotive areas, but I think they're relatively small in isolation. What's really missing is any wider material plan for the broader economy.
Ben, thank you. Maybe we could just sort of get your view a little bit of what investors would like to see from the next government.
I think what investors are really clamoring for is stability, and that might have to come after the election once whoever is in power has a chance to lay out their stall a little bit more. But it's stability, I think, that's been missing. Even though one party has been in power for a number of years, there's been different sort of sub-regimes. Within that, we've had, just looking at Conservative Prime Ministers, Cameron, then May, then Johnson, then Truss, then Sunak. So even within one party, there have been several different, effectively, mini eras. And that's made it difficult, I think, for businesses to plan ahead. So I think what investors and business are looking for is some sense of stability and more pro-business rhetoric, particularly rewarding businesses for investing in long-term productivity. Because again, it's crucial to get that idea across that if we want to grow our way out of the current difficult tax situation, then businesses need to be able to invest to achieve that productivity growth. And I think also what we need and what investors will be hoping for is a steering away from windfall taxes. We've seen one or two windfall taxes on oil and gas in limited amounts. That's okay. What's important is we don't create this environment or this sense from the investing and business community that anytime you make supernormal profits, the government's just going to come and tax it. We're not there, but I think whichever government gets in, investors will be looking for signs that they will allow businesses to flourish rather than jumping on any profit and taxing it away.
James, if I turn to you, maybe we can just touch a little bit about pension planning. I know Labour's backtracked on their plans to reintroduce the lifetime allowance, but they have said they'll review pension legislation if elected. What do you think they could do as part of that review?
It's a great question. I think that there's two avenues that I think that they could look to go down if looking to raise tax. And to go back to Ben's point, that it does feel like there is a need, or there could be a desire to raise taxes one format or another if the growth that is hoped for, to use Ben's words, isn't achieved necessarily. That the first thing that's been mentioned is that they might look to just apply a flat rate of tax relief when paying into a pension. So at the moment, you get tax relief based on whichever rate of income tax you pay. So people paying 40 and 45% rates of income tax get 40 and 45% tax relief when they pay into their pension. So they could look to realign that as a single flat rate of tax relief. However, there was an article the other day from Steve Webb, the former pensions minister, that said while this in practice could be something they look to do, it could then be very complicated in terms of how they actually come to administer it. And he felt like it would be a bit too difficult to have this work in practice, because then we have to consider not only what tax relief are you getting on the way in, but what rate of tax are people paying on the way out, and that could this create some form of retrospective tax charges if people already with pension funds are then going to be taxed in a different way to which they expected when they first paid into the pension? So that's the first thing they could look at. In reality, it might be easier for them to play around with what the annual limits are on pension contributions again, but when doing this, they have to be very careful about affecting different groups, particularly doctors, and whether they might be inadvertently hitting them with additional tax charges given how good the NHS pension scheme. So the first is, how is it they look at tax relief on the way in? The other thing I think could be under review is how death benefit taxation operates on pensions. That when the lifetime allowance was removed, the way the Conservative government put it was that they're removing the lifetime allowance, so removing some tax charges that could be payable during your life, but they'd be introducing what's called the lump sum death benefit allowance, which would have capped the amount of tax-free benefits the next generation could receive. So the implication there was that we won't tax it during life, but we're probably going to tax it more on death. With the iterative changes that we've seen coming out on pension legislation, it is still actually possible now for people to inherit a pension, keep it within the pension, and if death had occurred before 75, there's no tax payable. If death occurs after 75, those beneficiaries can choose when it is they pay an income tax charge. So from a UK budgetary perspective, that's quite a challenge, in that, in theory, people could just defer when they draw paying from these funds indefinitely and never have to pay any tax charge on it. To me, what could feel sensible is if they look to apply a tax charge on death itself based on the value of benefits, but then look to not have a later tax charge apply on drawing income. If it were me, that's what I could see as the simplest way of doing it. But of course, I've been surprised by legislation changes before. Lucy, I thought it could be an interesting question for you, that what do you think it could mean around, what do you see could change around capital gains tax and inheritance tax, and what could that mean around businesses in particular as well?
Yeah, well, there has been quite a lot of talk about raises in capital gains tax, especially. And I think the Liberal Democrats in their manifesto have said that they intend to raise capital gains tax, which is an interesting point to consider when thinking about it in the context of deals, because obviously an increase in the rate of capital gains tax would mean a reduction in the take-home proceeds for those business owners. And the obvious question is that going to put them off? Which it could do. The flip side of that is a timing thing. When would we expect to see the changes to capital gains tax rates? If it was from next April, that maybe produces a window to get deals through the line. So there could be a slight increase in deals in the short term and then an expected decrease in the longer term, which then is something worth considering. If you do increase that rate and reduce the number of deals, does that then mean the actual take home of capital gains tax doesn't increase because you've reduced the number of deals to compensate for the higher rate? So it's an interesting one to think about. And I guess the increase in capital gains tax rate has been threatened a number of times over the last certainly 5 or so years. We've had a few incidents where we've expected it to go up and it's not happened for whatever reason. So it'll be an interesting one to see how it plays out. On the other side of that, on the IHT side of things, there's been a lot of talk about BPR and whether that will remain as generous as it is now. And which I think is an interesting point, thinking about it from a similar perspective, in that when you've got a trading company that qualifies for inheritance tax relief via BPR, you are then encouraging taxpayers to hold on to that asset until they die and let it pass on death because it passes free from inheritance tax. So maybe changes to BPR could encourage more selling. You just don't know. It's one of those, should tax drive any of these things? Probably not, but it is a factor and something that could have an impact should we see any quite drastic changes.
Lucy, I think obviously business owners are concerned about their position and how they access their investment or access their income generated by the business. But let's, and Ben picked up on it earlier. There's Labour and the Conservative parties have both said they'll not raise corporation tax for at least the next 5 years. But what are the benefits of freezing corporation tax? And are there any negatives of keeping it at the current rate, at the main rate of 25%?
It's a really good question. And I think it goes back to what Ben was saying at the start. What businesses say time and time again is that they want stability when it comes to corporation tax. And so freezing the rate gives them 5 years of stability, which means they can plan, they can make long-term investment decisions, they can really think about the future without having changes to tax rates every year, which you can see from a business's perspective how that would be difficult to plan for. The other thing is when, like, and linking it back to what we've just said about deals, is when we think about value, the value of a business on a deal, typically that value is calculated above or is based on earnings before interest and tax. So like tax doesn't really impact the value from that perspective. So that's a good thing. I feel like when you talk about a tax take in a business, it's less personal than the CGT and IHT. Like even business owners, that's their money, whereas the business's money is a different psychology, which is quite interesting. And the flip side of freezing the corporation tax rate is obviously we have quite a generous regime at the minute when it comes to full expensing, which both parties have said they're going to keep. And at a higher rate of tax, you are saving more by getting that relief. So that's positive. And as Ben alluded to before, both have said that they are going to keep the innovation relief such as R&D and patent box. Again, both generous reliefs that are competitive on an international basis. So there are plenty of positives in there. I guess the negative side of keeping a 25% rate of corporation tax is it on an international stage, it's maybe quite high. But the other side of that is that we now have a global minimum rate of tax at 15%. So I think we do see less shopping around for tax rates, and companies tend to locate where they commercially need to locate. So I don't think that would be an overwhelming concern for certainly not our clients.
Thank you, Lucy. James, maybe we could pick up on what the two main parties have said about income tax and that they're not intending to increase income tax rates. But the Liberal Democrats have said they would raise the personal allowance and then look to raise income tax when finances allow. How different is this approach from the main parties who have pledged to freeze thresholds until 2028?
They're both different approaches, but in reality, they're both trying to do the same thing one way or another, but it feels like they're trying to do it in a way that feels different politically. So if you take the example of the Liberal Democrats that said that they'll look to increase thresholds, but then also look to increase the tax rate, that they're increasing how much you can receive at any particular rate and not have to pay more tax, but they might therefore make you pay more tax on a smaller amount, effectively. So you've got your rate increase, but the amount that you pay it on is decreased effectively, so you're getting out to a similar sort of rate, or even a higher rate overall, rather than necessarily similar to what it was. For the Conservative government and Labour, and particularly what the Conservative government has been doing over the last few years already, is that they've been increasing the overall tax take, but while being able to say politically, we haven't raised taxes, because what they've let happen is increasing incomes and asset values over time has meant that more people are paying tax at the higher rate, or more people are paying inheritance tax, has been mentioned before already, but just at the same percentage rate as it was before. But by more people having higher incomes and higher asset values, even by keeping the percentage tax rate the same, it increases the overall tax rate for the UK government, and it also increases the overall effective rate of tax people are paying on their overall incomes and overall assets. It's been deemed a number of different times sort of a stealth tax over the years, and it is something people need to be careful of, is that even though the headline rate isn't going up, by keeping allowances fixed for a number of years, it should be increasing the amount of tax they pay over time, certainly.
Okay. And one of the things we've not really touched upon when we've been talking about tax rates up to now is the impact of the international perspective for individuals. Each manifesto and a common theme throughout the discussion of tax and the election over the last few months has been around closing loopholes for non-DOMs. And we saw that process really start in March with the Conservative government's budget, where they were looking to move non-DOMs and the tax regime for non-domiciled individuals to a residency-based system. The consequence of that was that under those rules, after 4 years of residency, people from overseas will be paying the same tax basis as anybody from born raised in the UK. I guess when you look through the manifestos, and when I've taken a look through the manifestos, there's certainly been comments around what might happen, and in the press we've heard various announcements. I think if we look at where we were, we seem to still have protected trust status as an option, which certainly had inheritance tax benefits for certain grandfathered offshore trusts. The government in March also announced a number of transitional provisions to move people off the non-dom regime and into the residency system. And some of the parties have sort of discussed to a certain degree how they might tighten up on some of those provisions to deal with that transition from one regime to the other. I suspect we'll see a lot of changes on closing those loopholes in the next few months, in the same way that you might hope to see more detail about where the policy on income tax is going to go more widely. Lucy's point around capital gains tax. So we'll have to somewhat sort of wait and see. But Ben, with all of these changes or lack of clarity of them, the hopeful clarity that we will get in the coming weeks, how does that impact on the attractiveness of the UK amongst international investors?
I think it's the first order effects are probably quite limited, because a lot of these rule changes are aimed at individuals rather than businesses and the economy. So I think in terms of the fundamental attractiveness, for now, it's a little bit more limited. Of course, a lot of non-DOMs are going to be international investors, but then the broader international investor community, non-DOMs are probably only a very small part of that overall. I think it's much more about sentiment, and I think it doesn't necessarily make the UK less attractive. Potentially, it might make it a slightly less attractive place to live for some investors, but it shouldn't really affect directly the underlying market. But again, like we were talking earlier about some of the windfall taxes and other elements, in and of itself, these changes probably don't change the attractiveness the UK market. But there is always the risk that if you start to be seen as being less friendly to international investors, then that could start to change some of the sentiment. So it's probably more a sentiment risk rather than a fundamental attractiveness risk. And it's going to be a calibration that any government is going to need to think about. The one area that's related that perhaps would change some of the views, but none of the parties are talking about, is stamp duty reserve tax. Now, this is a tax that investors have to pay. It's about 0.5%, or it is 0.5% on the purchase of most shares in the UK. And the UK is starting to become an outlier in charging this sort of share transaction based tax, but none of the parties are talking about it. If the government wants to change the attractiveness of UK equities to international investors, or investors generally, that's an area they could look at. But for now, that's not in scope of any of the parties.
Ben, thank you. Let's wrap up. Firstly, thank you very much to Ben, Lucy, and James for joining me today. There are a number of themes that each manifesto seems to be covering. I guess the point that seems to sort of run throughout all of them is the focus on growth, despite some of the warnings about balancing the books and the IMF's comments a couple of months ago around needing to be careful of tax cuts. Some parties talk about increasing taxes, others are hoping much more for a growth in the economy. There is, in any event, a real change in terms of tax and the landscape for tax in the next few months. It was really important to keep focused on planning for the future and creating flexibility within that plan, so that as and when we learn more about those changes, you can reflect those in whatever you're doing. Our next episode will be released on Friday, the 5th of July. We'll be joined by our economist, George Ligarius, who will give us an update on how the markets have reacted to our new government. Thank you for listening today. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review after listening.